So thank you very much for introducing and for inviting me in this place. So thank you to all the persons involved in this event and to all of you. Well, to bring up my subject, I'd like to show two images that can both explain what is meant by the word dissensus and what kind of connection between art and politics is implied in the notion of dissensus. Well, this first image is an image of a barricade in the streets of Paris during the workers' insurrection that took place in June 1848. Well, this is an engraving published by an English conservative newspaper to illustrate the insurrection in Paris. But what is interesting is that it's not a scene of struggle. On the contrary, the rebels seems to be posing on the barricade. On the foreground, two small groups of insurgents are set up symmetrically as on a stage. Behind them, another group on the left, emerging from a kind of grotto, looks like a band of conspirators in a melodrama. And on top of this, there is this sign that tells in French, complet, which means full or sold out. Well, this is a perception of the barricade that the draftsman wants to convey. All this is theater. But in spite of his prejudices, I think he tells something true about this theatricality of the barricade. It is not simply a military construction used against the troops of the government. It's also a disruption of the normal distribution of spaces, because in this normal distribution, the place of the workers is in the workshops, while the place for politics is in the parliament and the state offices, where those who have the capacities required for this deal with the common matters of the community. Plato had told it long ago in his Republic, the artisans cannot be at another place than their workshop because work doesn't wait, and it's impossible to do two things at the same time. This is to say, they cannot be at the assembly. They cannot be at the place where the discussion and decisions about the common matters of the city take place. This is the main point. Before being a matter of institutions and laws, of power and struggles for power, politics deals with the configuration of a common word. It deals with the very distribution of spaces and times, occupation and capacities, a distribution which is both material and symbolical. There is a normal word, a consensual word, in which everybody is at his or her place, performing his or her own business, and using the capacities fitting this place and this business. This is what consensus means, deeply understood. Politics starts with dissensus, but dissensus is not a conflict of groups, interests, of values. It's a conflict of words. It's a conflict about the existence or the inexistence of a common word, and about what is included in this word and who is included and how they are included. Well, in my book, Disagreement, I commented on a modern rewriting of the story of the cessation of the Roman plebeians on the Aventine. A rewriting made by a French author 20 years before those barricades were built. The core of the conflict for him was not about the claims of the plebeians. It was about the fact that the patricians could not even hear them, because for them, the plebeians did not speak. What came out of their mouths was not language, it was only noise. And in order to make their claims audible, the plebeians must construct the common space within which they are heard as speaking beings. So the insurgents showing off on the barricade make a similar demonstration. It's not only a protection against the troops of the government. It is the material and symbolical configuration of a people at odds with the order within which the workers work, the representatives discuss in the assembly, and the governments decide. This configuration goes through a whole redistribution of spaces and functions. The barricade has been made with the stones which normally pave the street and make it a space for circulation, with the carts that are normally used for carrying goods and the furniture of the houses that is normally used for family life. It's also a whole subversion of the normal distribution of spaces, functions, and identity. And this creates a new public space, a space where the artisans affirm that they are human beings sharing the same time and space, the same capacities of seeing, doing, and speaking as those who subdue them to their role. This inversion is theatrical. This doesn't mean that it is a mere play or spectacle. Simply, the theater is a place where people lose their identity. The same philosopher, namely Plato, who wanted that the workers stay in their workshop and do only their own business, also wanted the theater to be removed from the city because the theater is a place specifically dedicated to the activity consisting in doing two things at once. The poets put their own speech in the mouths of fictional characters that are played by actors, displaying emotions and passions that are not theirs. Well, this is how politics and art first meet, as forms of dissensus, forms of conflict about the distribution of the sensible. The action of the insurgent workers can be said to be aesthetic because it subverts the normal landscape of the city, its normal distribution of spaces, times, and activities. Correspondingly, an artistic practice can be said to be political, not because it conveys messages about society and power or arouses energies for struggle, but because it constructs specific spatial and temporal dispositifs within which the normal relationships between ways of being and ways of doing are subverted. This is what is illustrated by the second image. If you can move to the second image now. So an image was taken during the protest of Gezi Park in Istanbul 3 years ago. And which shows us the intervention of an artist in this context. Well, the character here now is well known. It is the dancer and choreographer Erdem Gündüz, who made himself known as the standing man, as he stood motionless in front of a symbol of the Turkish Republic, the picture of Atatürk on the Atatürk Cultural Centers. No women's, no violence here. And the performer can hardly be said to perform. You don't need to be a professional performer to stay motionless during hours. But we can turn the proposition around. You don't need to move for performing. Standing motionless during hours with your eyes staring at the same image is a performance, since it disrupts the normal way of behaving in the street, which is to move forward. This performance was perfectly attuned to the political dynamic of the Gezi Park movement, because first the process was born from a quarrel about a material and symbolical matter of disruption of spaces. It was born from the decision of the government to turn a free space with all kinds of use into a shopping mall. Next, the form taken by the protest was the form of the occupation, disrupting the normal use of a space, traffic, to turn it into both a political agora and a place for living and common. So the Gezi Park occupation and the performance of the standing man play in a pacific way the same conflict of times and space that was played out violently by the insurrection and the barricade. Now there is something more in the performance of the standing man. Another form of dissensus, blocking the normal relationship between sense and sense. I mean, the relationship between something which is given to sense perception and the sense or the meaning that can be made of it. Consensus means the agreement between sense and sense. It means that there exists a normal relationship between a spectacle and its meaning, a gesture and its function, an action and its timing. Dissensus breaks this normal agreement. It creates a distance or a discordance between what is given to the perception and the meaning of this given. And this is what happened in this case. The standing man did not block the traffic, but he blocked the circulation between a spectacle and its meaning. At the beginning, even the activists did not understand what he was doing, what the point of it was. And it was through that perceptive trouble that they could get the sense of its performance and join it. So the theatrical effect here is not an effect of showing, it's an effect of mediation. A gesture produces another gesture through a conversion of the gaze. Because at the beginning, the viewer doesn't know what he or she sees, but precisely not knowing what one sees is a good definition of what seeing means. Such is the effect of estrangement that was first analyzed by Viktor Shklovsky in Tolstoy's novels, before being taken up by Bertolt Brecht as a revolutionary weapon. Well, out of those two images, we can get a first view of how Dissensus works and defines a space of connection of political action and artistic performance, a space of meeting, mediation, exchange, or possibility, confusion. I think they define two main figures of Dissensus. Dissensus are the subversion of the normal distribution of spaces, times, and occupation. Dissensus as a reform of our perception. From these two figures, it's possible to draw two main forms of connection between political action and artistic performance that are a model of immediate fusion or a model of distance and mediation. On the one hand, there is the form of identification of artistic practice with the construction of forms of life. On the other hand, there is a strategic view of the relation between art and politics, where art is supposed to reform our perception, so as to create a political consciousness and will. The story of political revolutionary art during the last century was that of a navigation between those two poles, but also a demonstration of the dialectic inherent in each of them. A dialectic sorting their effects and creating a multiplicity of forms of interlacing and overturning. Well, to give an overview of this dialectic, I shall start again from two images. So here is the image of a work by a contemporary artist who is well known, both as an artist and an activist, Ai Weiwei. Well, the work was showed in the Tate Liverpool Museum some years ago. It's called Working Progress, Fountain of Life. Well, obviously, it is a replica of the famous Tatlin's monument to the Third International. A replica that turns it into a candlelight standing on a platform on a pool. It's easy then to see it as postmodern parody, showing us what the great architectural utopias have become in a time when everything has become as liquid as the water on which the candlelight is floating. But I think that we can take a more complex view of it. This floating construction also points to the ambiguity inherent in its model. If we can look now, next image, Tatlin's, well, the scale model of Tatlin's Tower. Tatlin's Tower was part of a revolutionary project, well, of fusion of art and life, which also meant a fusion of artistic practice and political practice in the same material transformation of the landscape of the community. As is well known, artists should no more create artwork for art space. Even more, they should not produce artworks to mobilize revolutionary energy. They would shape directly, in the most material sense of the word, the spaces of a new life. And architecture is par excellence the art that achieves this unity of art and life. But it is also the art that reveals the inner dialectic of this project. What do I mean by this inner dialectic? On the one hand, the self-suppression of art as a separate activity destroys the consensual order within which each activity, industrial work, art, private life, public life, etc., has its own space. So it shapes a new common life which is undivided, a life where there are no more distinctions between the utilitarian work, destined to serve the material needs of the people and the artistic work made for producing aesthetic pleasure. But on the other hand, this project was made to clear the space where Dissensus could happen. It was destined to shape a world in which the form of life of the community and the individuals is embodied in the very architecture of space, as well as in the design of the furniture, the objects of everyday life, etc. So it's destined to shape a common space, we can say, without any barricade, a common space where nothing and nobody would block the street. But this clearing of the space sets to work another dialectic, a dialectic of immediacy and mediation. Architecture must not only construct the buildings of the new world, it must also construct the sense of space within which these buildings must be built, seen, and inhabited. It must give a visual symbolization of its own practice. The theoreticians of the arts and craft movement had already summed it up in two words. Architecture and design are both to shelter life and to express it. Tatlin's Tower must not only shelter the administration of the Communist International, it must also express the new communist life. And this is where Dissensus comes back and takes on a specific form, namely the form of a disorientation of space. Well, the main visual feature of the projected tower is its oblique and helical aspect. Obliqueness was the main characteristic, as we know, of Soviet avant-garde art at that time. And we find it as well in a functional, it can be called functional project, such as the Lenin's Tribune, as what we can see now, okay? Or next, the abstract forms like L. Lissitzky, Brown's, next, or even in representations of ordinary life, such as Rodchenko's photograph. Next. Well, obviously, the oblique line has nothing functional about it. It expresses the new life. It expresses its dissensual character in relation to the old world. It frames a new common space which has two main characteristics. First, it is a non-hierarchical space where the very opposition of high and low has been subverted. In that sense, the tower has no top and no foot. Rather, it's a vessel with a bow and a stern, a vessel being launched into the sky. And this is the second aspect. The oblique and helical lines frame a space that has become time, a space driven into the air by the forward movement of a time, so to say, ahead of itself. Well, I have already analyzed the same kind of space in the posters designed by the Steinberg brothers to advertise Dziga Vertov's film Man with a Movie Camera. So we can see one of them on the next image. Okay. Well, what is interesting is that it is the same logic. The posters don't propose images of the film. Instead, they construct the sensorium with which the film has been made and must be seen. And it is a very peculiar combination of homogeneity and heterogeneity. It is a space within which words, images, and movements are made homogeneous. And this formal homogeneity expresses itself the movement of a collective life in which the ecstatic living performance of a dancer is identical to the automatic movement of a machine. But this homogeneity has one condition, which is the construction of this strange, distorted space in which a dancer has no ground for her feet. Because what first seemed to be a checkered ground for dancing has been turned into a skyscraper and going into the sky, and the fragmented lips of the dancer are combined with the spirals of the letters so as to evoke, at the same time, the lens of a camera and a propeller launching a vessel into the open space, or rather, into the time to come. So the poster and the film itself want to frame directly the new sensorium within which art and life, words and images, industrial performance and production and artistic performance are one and the same movement. But this immediate identity still has to be mediated by its own symbolization, which takes on the shape of an impossible space. And we can, when we see the film, we can see that the spatial disorientation of the poster is echoed by the paradoxical temporality of the film itself. Because the film, in a sense, is an anti-film. It's not a fiction telling a story, but an artistic experiment, identical to a social experiment. It's a construction of the time within which all the activities performed during a single day in the factories, the shops, the streets, or elsewhere, become the equal components of a global movement, which is communism itself as a material reality, a common fabric of life. But this homogeneous time is constructed on one condition. The condition is that each of those activities be disconnected from its own temporality, be reduced to an equal quantity of movement, so that they can all glide on each other and penetrate each other. This also means that each of those activities must be disconnected from its specific ends, from the combination of tasks that it requires, and from its links with other activities in a wider industrial and economic logic. So the self-suppression of art in order to directly shape new forms of life remains an aesthetic performance, a representation of communism beside its industrial and political reality. Well, as is well known, the film was rejected as formalism, and Tatlin's monument remained a scale model. It remained a strange object in the landscape of the common world, either a relic of the lost utopia or a fountain of life, a beacon, an enduring appeal to a reform of our perception and our way of inhabiting the world. This is a real issue at stake when we compare the new tower by Ai Weiwei with the old one by Tatlin. Rather than focus on the distance of utopia to reality, I think it's worth focusing on the inner dialectic of the artistic dissensus. Dissensus always navigates between the pole of a material transformation of the sensible world and the pole of an inner transformation of the faculty of perceiving and judging. But also its navigation always makes one logic reappear at the core of the other. Tatlin's Tower, Lissitzky Prose, or Vertov's films were part of an aesthetic revolution aimed to construct the material forms of the new life. But the construction of this new life was first the construction of the very form of its visibility. And the construction of this form of visibility remained the construction of an image, an anticipation of the word to come, an image calling for a reform of perception. Well, but the consequence that should be drawn from these contradictions proves contradictory itself. The failure of the proposition of direct fusion of art and life normally leads to the conclusion that to act politically, art must act from its very distance instead of fantasizing about its self-suppression. This is notably the construction that Bertolt Brecht drew in his text, in the text written in 1939 on the experimental theater. Well, the attempts at making the revolution of art identical to evolution of the lived world had just created, he said, new forms of artistic enjoyment and excitement. They did not provide any education. So it was time, after those utopias, to reaffirm the educational power of art as a specific tool in the destruction of the old world, a tool that produces a transformation of the visibility of that world, a reform of the perception enabling the viewers to be aware of its hidden and conflictual reality and to take the right stance in the conflict. As we know, Brecht found the principle of this educational strategy in the concept of estrangement elaborated by Viktor Shklovsky. But this concept itself implies another form of dialectic of immediacy and mediation, the inside and the outside. Estrangement for Shklovsky was not the specific tool of a political art. It was a essential operation of art in general, an operation freeing the objects from the automatisms of perception and turning something which is already well known into something that we perceive for the first time. But what is exactly the political effect of the operation? Shklovsky, it is well known, analyzed the estrangement effect in Tolstoy's short story Kolstomer. In this novel, in this short story, the narration is made by a horse, and the horse confesses his incapacity to understand what men mean when they use the personal pronoun my. How can a man say my horse when he never rides on it and never takes care of it? Well, we can say this is a radical critique of property, but this radical critique of property is the critique of the outsider, the critique of the one who sets himself outside the universe of signification. It is not destined to provoke a political awareness of social relations of property and a desire to destroy them. So to turn estrangement into a political education, Brecht had to overturn its logic. Shklovsky had destined it to free the object from the universe of signification and make it an object of direct, unmediated perception. Brecht, on the contrary, destined it to make the underlying signification of the estranged object appear. The fresh, nonsensical perception produced by the operation of the estrangement had to be just a step leading to the discovery of the sense of the nonsense, the revelation of the social reality accounting from the strange appearances of the stage. Thus, estrangements become some kind of Platonic operation of the shadows in the cave. But to denounce the shadows in the cave, it is well known, you must already be outside the cave. You must have already broken your chains in order to draw the right conclusion from the strange appearance. You must already be outside the realm of theatrical appearance, in the realm of knowledge where the reality underlying and producing the appearance is already known. You must already get the knowledge that the estranging operation is destined to produce. This is the first point, but there is also a second point. There is no evidence that the knowledge of a reality produces by itself the energy to change it. Knowing the real relationships, structuring the world, doesn't produce by itself any peculiar desire to change the world, except, again, for those who already are willing to change it. Plato also told it, unless he is constrained, the philosopher will not leave the contemplation of the idea for the painstaking management of the affairs of the city. So the pedagogy of Dissensus appears to be broken here at its two strategic points, the point where nonsense must produce sense, and the point where knowledge must produce action. The direct construction of the new forms of life proved to be ultimately the production of an image, but the pedagogy of estrangement undergoes a symmetric contradiction. It is efficient to the extent that the space of its efficiency, the space within which nonsense makes sense and knowledge produces action, already exists. The theatrical distance only works when the distance is abolished. Well, by sketching the two aspects of this dialectic of Dissensus, I don't want to produce a skeptic or nihilistic view of its illusions. I showed how its practice navigates between two poles and proves self-contradictory at each of these poles. But what interests me is the navigation itself, the space within which the two forms of Dissensus undergo a multiplicity of intertwinements, and the contradictions are set to work and produce a multiplicity of singular formations. This navigation gave birth to a form of compromise between the two paradigms of dissensus that took on the name of critical art. Critical art is not simply a form of art oriented by the desire to criticize the social order, or rather it is a specific mode of existence of art in the distribution of spaces, forms of exhibition, and modes of interpretation that shape our social life. Before meaning polemical stance, critique means separation. Critical art designates a form of compromise between the two forms of dissensus, reshaping the distribution of social spaces and activities, and reforming the perception. And what happened is that this compromise tended to identify the spaces of art, their being both separated from and in relation to each other social space, to identify this with a essential function that would more or less belong to art as such. Now, this entails a complex rethinking of the space of art, a complex definition of a complex assessment of the definition of the art place, of its nature and function, and its relation to its outside. On the one hand, it appeared at a certain moment that the form of existence of art consisted in creating spatial dispositives in order to rearrange the common settings of spaces, objects, and uses. The triumph of installation, and notably multimedia installation, can clearly be viewed as the transposition in the art space of the architectural project of reshaping life. It went along with the transformation that made exhibition itself an artwork. Much has been told about this becoming art of the exhibition and the birth of a new artist named curator. Some critics saw in this invention a manifestation of the neoliberal cult of creativity. I think it's more relevant to trace it back to the dreams of the revolutionary reshaping of spaces. After all, at that time, even in the 1920s, the inventions of constructivist artists in Russia found their best efficiency in the construction of international exhibition pavilions. So our contemporary art, I think, has retained from the art of the 1920s the model of the architectural fusion of arts. It creates spatial dispositives and environments by combining the techniques and the resource of a multiplicity of art. But this art of the fusion of arts is no more destined to construct a new age and a new form of temporality. It is destined to be walked through and seen in spaces specifically devoted to art. It has become a specific art named contemporary art, where the inventions destined to reframe the landscape of the common life has been reinvested in the reframing of the art spaces. On the other hand, this transformation produces a new form of mobilization of the space, which destines it to a new form of the reform of perception. Critical artists wanted the visual forms to compose some kind of discursive dramaturgy, or rather they wanted them to play a double role, to be at the same time the elements of construction of a space and the elements of a discourse. Exhibitions are supposed to tell stories. And even now we know that the museum itself tends to be no more the place destined to the conservation of artworks, but a place destined to the exhibition and re-exhibition of its collections, periodically rearranged to tell new stories about themselves. The art place, then, plays the part of a theater destined to the estranging operation of the reform of perception. The exhibitions of critical art wanted the display of artistic artifacts to play the role of a Brechtian dramaturgy, the production of an oddity that must reveal and denounce the normal way of things. And it's used for, and this combination of the architectural model and the theatrical model defined a new form of dialectic of the inside and the outside, of separation and unseparateness. On the one hand, the art place was thought of as a separate place where separateness was used to display a mode of exhibition of objects and signification at odds with the dominant mode of their production and exhibition. On the other hand, the art place became the place where the very separateness of art was called into questions by the introduction of objects, performances, and situations belonging to the worlds of commerce, prosaic life, or popular culture. Those two strategies had led to contradictory and self-contradictory effects. The first one led to forms of subtraction that might consist in emptying the space of art exhibition or transforming it into a kind of classroom where the only exhibits were text, ultimately reduced to the dictionary definitions of words, starting, of course, with the word art. The second one, on the contrary, played on the accumulation of commercial items or forms of entertainment, using them at the same time to mock the high art pretensions to separateness and to create a distance in order to provoke a new awareness of the empire of commodities, entertainment, and spectacle. In my book, The Future of the Image, I analyzed an outstanding case of this double play, an exhibition which was presented in the United States with the pop title, Let's Us Entertain, and in France with the hard critical title, Beyond the Spectacle. As a matter of fact, this succession of pieces, both replicating and mocking or subverting popular games such as football table, billiards, carousels, commercial mangas, disco music, and so on, could be looked either as derision of high art or critique of the society of the spectacle. The estrangement effect in Paris was produced by the labels, which played the part of a pedagogical blackboard. Well, of course, critical art underwent the same problem as its theatrical Brechtian model. It could reveal the truth hidden behind the spectacle of the commodity or the dependence of art upon capital only to those who ignore them. And the problem was that the number of those ignorants was dramatically decreasing, especially among the visitors of art exhibition. But what was also dramatically decreasing at the same time was the evidence of any consequence from the perception of this hidden social truth to any form of revolt against this social order. On the contrary, the denunciation of this commodity, the consumer society, and the spectacle that were ceaselessly produced and reproduced by critical thought and critical art engendered either a sense of fatality or even a reversal of the denunciation, which targeted no more a system of domination but those who were subjected to it. But as I said earlier, critical art is not only a strategy, it's a dispositif. That's why it could brush aside its pretension to reveal the unknown reign of commodity, spectacle, or exploitation in a more modest, modest way, where it affirmed its will to explore or investigate or address or well, there are a lot, of synonyms, to say this kind of distance, no more making a clash, destined to provoke some kind of dialectical revelation, but just exploring, investigating, addressing, etc. Some issues of class, race, sex, globalization, migrations, etc. So as to produce no more, a definite clash, but some kind of suspension of whose effect is unpredictable. Well, on the one hand, the modesty of the purpose doesn't change the dispositif. It doesn't change the dramaturgy of the installations and exhibition, which remains still defined by two relations. First, relationships of the inside to this outside, whose objects, situation, interpretations, or attitudes are reset in the space of the art place. Second, the combination and tension between an architectural dramaturgy of construction of the space and a theatrical dramaturgy of estrangement. But that combination itself took on the main aspect of a suspension, the resetting of the objects, attitudes, situation, or interpretations, suspend their normal, consensual arrangement. But this doesn't result in the production of a reconfiguration of reinterpretation of the common words. Now there are two opposite ways of understanding this suspension. A widespread political interpretation names it fleetingness and interprets it as an adhesion to the logic of the so-called late capitalism, a logic of dematerialization of production, flexibility of time, reign of communication, and ambiguity of meaning. In this case, Ai Weiwei's floating tower can be looked as kind of parody and in fact an adhesion to this new capitalist world where every social reality has become liquid and every interpretation slippery. And of course, it is so because the exhibition took place in a museum housed in a former warehouse in the docks of what had been a great industrial harbor, Liverpool. And the fact is that nowadays, the initiative in the subversion of the normal distribution of spaces belongs to the financial capital that has erased factories, relocated industry in remote countries, transformed industrial zones into wastelands, left factories and warehouses at the disposal of art production and exhibition, and possibly prompted the development of cultural industry as an alternative to the lost industrial and commercial activity. We certainly cannot ignore the fact that capitalism has its own forms of mobilization and estrangement. But I don't think that for all of that, the contemporary practices of suspension, can be seen as forms of adhesion to some kind of new reality of immaterial capitalism. First, because capitalism is not immaterial at all, but it is another aspect of the problem. But also because I think that this suspensive form, taken now by the critical dispositif, can be viewed, on the contrary, as a form of demobilization, reacting against the capitalist frenzy of movement that swipes aside forms of collective life, makes industrial work invisible, and erases the traces of history. In this context, Dissensus can take on the form of a counter-movement attempting to repatriate first into the space of art all that is constantly being swiped aside and erased in the consensual framing of our world. It is true that there is no direct consequence from the fact of repopulating by the means of art a common world and the fact of creating new collective forces. This is, I think, what appears clearly in some attempts to turn art exhibition into moments of creation of political dynamics. I'm thinking here of the last Venice Biennale and its central exhibition called All the World's Future. The exhibition was clearly destined to reaffirm a political capacity of intervention of art. As a matter of fact, this capacity appeared to be a capacity to restage the material and conflictual reality of our world, by both documenting present forms of domination and protest, and reviving the very sense of a common history, shaped by economic domination and and class conflicts. Yes. Well, move, for instance, to this image. So this was part of this pavilion, of this pavilion and this central exhibition. All the words future. So kind of reproduction by Jonathan Deller of this new device of control of worker speed and efficiency, invented by Motorola, notably for the use of Amazon. Or also you have, if we can move to the next image, there is a mess in the image. Where, for instance, so this is this huge room, you know, in which there were all those drawings made out of the reproductions and of all conflicts, you know, taking place all around the world. You can notably see, I think the next image must be something from Occupy Wall Street, you know. What I think interesting precisely for Dissensus, because of the motto, lost my job, found an occupation. So occupation as disoccupation or counter occupation. While there was, so I think the next image must be, you know, this this jukebox also presented by Jonathan Deller, you know, to allow the spectators to hear the sounds of the factory. Well, the point was about the capacity of those testimonies of the past and the present of common history to engender all the world's futures announced, you know, by the curator. Well, apparently this task had been assigned to a certain form of theatralization. At the center, you know, of the exhibition and of the pavilion was the Das Kapital Oratorio, meaning the performance of comedians who 3 times a day read an extract of Marx's Capital, which means that the book played several roles at the same time in this kind of theatrical dispositif. It was part of this continent of history and thought reintroduced in the present that had erased them, and reintroduced by a reading which made it entirely material. So reading Capital did not simply mean interpreting Capital, but reading it materially. This was the first aspect, but also, of course, the Capital was read as the theory able to give sense to the materials scattered all around. But also it was the center of a dispositif of mobilization of those materials, as the reading was prolonged by a multiplicity of talks, discussions, performance in this central place called Arena. It was supposed to, I quote, flowed and suffused surrounding galleries with voices in an epic display of orality. The word epic, I think, is clearly redolent of Brecht's theory of the epic theater. So the diffusion of voices was thought of as a mobilization of the artists and the public, turning them to some kind of mobile agora, giving a collective sense, intellectual and physical sense, to the pieces of documentation, reflection, and reconfiguration or parody displayed in the galleries all around, so as to create the dynamic of those world's futures. Unfortunately, the dispositif mostly worked the other way around, whereas the voices should have mobilized the images imposed their law to the voice. Most of the visitors saw in the reading of Das Kapital and the talks and discussion of the Arena a performance, among others, a piece of art to which they cast the same quick glance as they did to the others. They took some pictures and then moved to another room. I'm not willing to pass judgment about the exhibition. I'm only concerned by the way in which Dissensus works or fails to work. From this point of view, what can be said is that the procedures of rematerialization and rehistoricization take on their meaning in a space of suspension, a space when the dominant sense of the present or the dominant sense of the real is suspended, is set aside, but also a space within which the link of this present, of this divided present, to a determinate future is itself suspended. But the question is not about suspension itself. It's about the strategy that wants to include it into a strategic program of production of knowledge or empowerment. Because suspension also means a disorder in the normal order of things, in which a determinate cause is supposed to produce a determinate effect. But this rupture is the essence of dissensus itself. Dissensus means the rupture of a state of things, a distribution of spaces and times, but also of modes of presentations, of form and intelligibility, the disruption of a normal way in which the same causes produce the same effects. It's not a strategic organization of conflicting forces. It's always a singular form or a moment of displacement or reconfiguration in which the space and or time is not occupied the same way as usual. A spectacle is different. People don't speak or act the way they should do or they are expected to do, etc., etc. Perhaps this essence of dissensus is best understood when the very borders between what is called art and what is called politics, what is art and what is not art or non-art are blurred. This happens when art is no more at home, dealing at home with the issues of the outside, when artists migrate towards zones which are not their zone, not the zones of art, or migrate, towards place where art appears, where it is not supposed to appear. I would like to examine two examples in which artists set out to disrupt in very different ways a given partition of spaces, times, identities, and capacity. So two practices very different because one belongs to what is usually called activist art. Another, on the contrary, belongs to the practice of the author, investing, politics of art in the production of a singular artwork. So I'm thinking first on the first side of the action of a group of artists, architects, writers, filmmakers, photographers, actors, and others. It's happening in the so-called jungle of Calais in the north of France, where migrants stay as they try to cross the channel and reach England. If we can move to the next image. So this is an image of a kind of political artistic performance, of migrants, who stitch their lips, to make it manifest that they were not heard. Well, but I'm not speaking specifically, about this, but about the action of this group of artists, and they try to disrupt, the normal distribution of position, in such places, because in relation to such spaces are the migrant camp or refugees camp, On the one side, now I'm speaking specifically of this camp known as the jungle near Calais in the north of France. On the one side, there is the attitude of the authority. The authority wants, to erase, of course, this jungle, these makeshift installations, and either send the migrants elsewhere or rehouse them in camps made of container-like cabins. On the other side, there is a position of either the political activists or the humanitarian activists denouncing their situation, denouncing state reception, and helping the migrants with food, material help, or juridical assistance. But this group of artists called Peru took a step aside from this normal distribution by focusing on the camp as a place where art already exists in the forms of individual or collective forms of life, with the photograph and the text published on their internet platform. They set out to show that even the makeshift cabins set up by the migrants proved a sense of form and the sense of inhabiting the world. Well, we can see one of these images Okay, so an image of the camp as an art place. They also took part in the construction of forms of collective life, such as a theater and a library, precisely to turn a camp not simply, in a camp, but in a form of urban life in a way. And eventually they imagined a whole urban plan. So they made a whole urban plan with the details of the project and the costs of the project. So a plan, an architectural plan, and plan of urbanization that would, as they say, reinvent Calais, so this place, reinvent it no more as a decent town, unfortunately spoiled by the plague of that muddy jungle, but the cosmopolitan town of the 21st century. They published this plan on the platform as an atlas of a potential city. But also they published it in the special issue of a magazine, which was a fake. It was in fact a fake, counterfeiting the real magazine published by the municipality. And in this fake magazine, they also published the letter of the mayor that the mayor did not write. The answers given by the French president, François Hollande, in an encounter with inhabitants that never took place, and so on. So a multiplicity of events that never existed. So they do certainly not expect their plan to be achieved and the town to be reinvented in the way they put it. But they certainly reinvented the form of visibility of this kind of place, a form of visibility of the dissensual form of visibility of the so-called crisis of the migrant or crisis of the refugees. And they did it by combining the tradition of the architectural reshaping of space with that of the critical tradition. In this case, the blurring of the normal distribution of tasks between art and politics results in putting politics in a place where its very presence was deemed impossible. I'd like now to examine the second example, which deals very differently with the case of the migrant worker. And I'm not saying at all that artists must specifically now, of course, deal with problems of migration. That's not my point at all. My point is about the redistribution, of the sensible word. So I'm thinking here of the case of the Portuguese filmmaker Pedro Costa, who has made 4 films with a small group of immigrants from Cape Verde, following then first in the shanty town of Fontenhas near Lisbon, then in the new white cubes where they are rehoused. He did not make films about their condition. He made films with them, spending during several times most of his time in their place and constructing the film with them. By working every day in this kind of constant reinvention of what the film had to be. Now, and the very construction of the film is worth examining, because at first sight, it is made of little scenes of everyday life. For instance, in the third film of his tetralogy, which is called Colossal Youth, matters of work, incidents at work, appointment with a council employee to obtain a council flat, various visits or conversation about the everyday life or about the past history of those migrants since they are in Portugal. And so this may appear as documentary stuff, but precisely it's a disruption of the normal, documentary organization of the stuff. The film doesn't follow the everyday of those migrants. Instead it stages various scenes, which in fact are some kind of, let us say, Brechtian little scenes or Brechtian's little dialogue. And so it appears more and more, but what these migrants are doing is acting, and that all the scenes are constructed, and that they are all characters replaying their own life in this form of Brechtian dialogue, and affirming for this interpretation their capacity of mastering their destiny, affirming a kind of theatrical capacity that appears where it is not supposed to happen. And this is particularly what happens in the scene what I'd like you to see with me. So scene of 4 minutes from this film, Colossal Youth, which was made, I think, approximately 10 years ago. So this is near the end of the film.
Esta flor, uma janela abaixo. Esta flor, uma janela abaixo. Meu 4 filhos, uma mulher, em cima de carro, tudo picadinho, picadinho. Esta flor, meu grita.
Grita tem copo de massa. Tinha minha mãe, meu pai, bombeiros, Santa Bárbara Generosa. Tem grita, vovó. Fica tudo escuro. Bota a minha mão.
O que mais?
Fica colado na parede, 1000 graus. Que estava ali de temperatura.
Quando tu me notícia de não chora.
O chora me. Já chora, tchau, vovó. Gata aeroporto.
Era o que te chorava.
E me que não tinha se bom morrer.
Mesmo que tinha se morrer no Marinho de Campo Grande afogado.
E me que não tinha de morrer naquele tempo. Aquele é o quarto de pequenote. Foi ali que não ficha. Cabe ninguém. Depois na parte de janela.
Mas nem polícia, nem copicão, nem cigano, nem branco, que consigo queimar nas balacas.
É falso que chega no colchão.
Para morte.
Para morrer é dificuldade que não atravessa.
Agora,
Agora,
o que eu estou fazendo?
quase. Não está vivo ali, bota sem a vizinho.
Não está mesmo ali em frente no meu 6 primeiro direito.
Já não esteve mais perto.
Bem vive comigo em que eu quarto.
E os filhos? É esse que me entoia na janela. É o tilde que entoia na janela.
Com brinca lento, que está ninguém na janela.
Vou conseguir tudo, Ventura. Água, eletricidade, gás, BI. Vou trabalhar dia e noite.
Eu durmo sozinho dentro.
Eu gostava de te oferecer 100.000 cigarros, uma dúzia de vestidos daqueles mais modernos, um automóvel, casinha de lava que tanto querias e um ramalhete de flor de 4 tostões. Mas antes de tudo, coisa. Bebe uma garrafa de um vinho bom e pense em mim. quarto ali de meu colher caixa. Foi ali que começa. Até lá o lento. Até lá o governo.
Well, what this episode, shows us, or should have showed you, is a break separating two spaces and two time. And, well, at the beginning of the episode, there is this opening of this burnt door that makes up really leave the normal landscape of misery to get into a theatrical space. The person who welcomes the hero, so the hero Ventura, who is also walking, its colleague, another mason, mason from Cape Verde named Lento. But all along the film, this mason, Lento, has embodied the character of the coarse and illiterate immigrant worker. Ventura vainly tried to teach him, during all the film, the text of a love letter, destined to his beloved in Cape Verde. But now Lento entirely sheds this rough appearance. It becomes, but of course you could not see it, it becomes a visionary emerging from the night. It takes Ventura's hand, they both stand in front of us like actors on the stage of a theater, and their dialogue takes on the form of a tragic psalmody with its alternated voice. He proudly recites the famous love letter he had always been unable to learn. It takes on the same ceremonious tone to tell how he lost his wife and children in the fire that he had himself lighted out of despair about their misery. But the Lento we had seen during all the film had no wife and no children. Even more, he had already died earlier in the film, he already died while falling from a pole while he was trying to connect their shack. So what he is telling here is not his history. It is something that happened to another immigrant family during the shooting of the film. So what he tells is a kind of condensation of the condition of all those who share their condition. But the important thing is the very way in which and the position from which he tells it. He tells it both as an actor who is making a performance of his life and of the life of his peers, but also as a kind of living dead, a mythical character coming from the inferno to tell the truth about the life of those who share their condition of living dead. So what we have here is an intertwining of temporalities. The normal temporality of their life, the documentary temporality of their life, is disrupted in two ways, by two other temporalities. The temporalities of the performance, within which the poor migrants are more than poor migrants. They are actors performing their own life. And there is a temporality of the myth, when they are both less and more than poor migrants, living dead, but also mythical characters, judges coming from the inferno to judge the living. Well, we can call it a radical suspension of a given distribution of spaces, times, capacities, and identities. At the same time, this radical suspension remains in the form of an artwork. It remains on the fragile surface of a screen and, with the kind of events that can happen as today, on the surface of a screen. So they don't anticipate, it doesn't anticipate any effect, just a little change in the ways of feeling and seeing of those who see the film, which is not your case today. But there is the additional problem that those are not many, since a film made by a film made by a filmmaker with immigrants in the suburbs of Lisbon, is precisely the genre of film that is automatically seen labeled as art film, film for festivals and museums, and not a film for spectators in movie theaters. So this is the destiny of this film. Nevertheless, it exists. It exists like this action made by this group of artists in the jungle of Calais, like a multiplicity of forms of little disruptions. It exists as a slight disturbance of the normal, of the order of things, among a multiplicity of other slight disturbances of the landscape of the sensible. Those slight disturbances do not produce specific effects of revelation or empowerment. They only shape other forms of sensitivity to what is seen, to how we look at it, how we understand it, how we name it, and how we act in this context. But also, they exist besides forms of political action that set to the fore again now, that have set to the fore again during the last years the aesthetic character of political action, and set it to the fore both as forms of spectacular reappropriation of a space of the common and as forms of suspension, breaking with the mainstream movement of our society. Well, I'm thinking, of course, of the various Occupy movements or form of political process that happened in several towns, you know, in our world during the last years, you know. And what I think is, well, interesting is that precisely those forms have put to the fore again this twofold aspect of dissensus. On the one hand, those movements have occupied the squares and the streets to give a physical reality to the construction of a people distinct from and opposed to the people represented in the state institutions. But that mobilization also involved a kind of demobilization. Not only did the occupiers in the street subvert the normal use of the urban space, they also subverted the normal use of the streets for political protest. Normally, protesters take to the streets and go over the streets to both make their demands visible and audible and embody the dynamic of their revolt or their protest. But, for instance, the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York started precisely with the decision of some protesters to stay instead of moving and discuss among them instead of shouting their demands to the authorities. This decision of staying was materialized by two forms of structuration of the space that are crucial, you know, to the form of occupation, the assembly and the tent. Well, the assembly, on the one hand, is the place where those who normally are not heard make themselves heard and constitute themselves as a community. But it was also for them the place of horizontality, the place where all individuals sit on the same ground as equal, where this equality is materialized as, you know, something which is an end in itself. As for the tent, it is a twofold symbol combining militant, if not military occupation, with a distance taken, you know, in front of a mainstream form of life. So the tent is both a symbol of provisional settlement and global contestation of the normal way of sitting in society. The occupation breaks away from a normal distribution of social occupation. But this breakaway is a kind of combination of mobilization and demobilization. On the one hand, the occupation repopulates the space of the common and mobilizes a new sense of the community. But on the other hand, it looks like a form of suspension or demobilization, creating empty spaces and empty times. This is the point where the motionless performance of the standing men that I evoked at the beginning could meet the mobilization of those who made assemblies and put their tents in the square. The dissensus doesn't oppose movement to immobility. It opposes the straightforward movement of things planned by the masters of the world with a counter-movement in which the very opposition is subverted, since the mobilization takes on the form of the installation of tents to stay in a place, and immobility produces, on the other side, a qualitative change, in the movement. Well, there is no direct connection between the artistic slight displacement that I evoked and the forms of mobilization, like those of the Occupy movements that happened in the squares of several towns during the last years. There is no direct connection, though we know that many artists took part in them, that many artists share the condition of those who took part in them, those who took to the streets to protest against their condition of precarious workers, but also to use this very state of precarious workers or part-time workers, using it, which means using in another way the capacities that don't find their place on the job market or in university, using it to shape new ways of being together and speaking and acting together. There is no direct connection. There are similarities. There are zones of proximity, zones where people try to slightly change the landscape of the common world within which they live. And I would say this is, for me, what emancipation means, or how emancipation starts. And I would end, by putting in front of you again, the very famous enigmatic end of Wilkes' well-known poem on the archaic torso of Apollo, so description of an archaic torso of Apollo, which ends brutally with the sentence, "You must change your life." How can the view of an antique, archaic torso change a life? How does an image, a play, a spectacle change a life? Well, much effort, I think, has been made, precisely, to erase the enigma, to put it aside, to tell instead the good way in which art practices result in political awareness or empowerment. But I think it may be a good time here, it may be a good thing, time and again, to leave the core of the enigma reappear. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Jacques Rancière. I would like to invite Gry Ulfeng, the artistic director of TOpublic, to join us on stage, and she and Jacques Rancière will have a conversation, after which we will open for questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Making this festival, we curators have our back to the social turn in the arts. And in a replacement for, strictly speaking, capitalistic and moralistic curating, we have tried to work, or we have worked with transformations and how it can be historical, personal and sacred, in theory and praxis, seen from the contemporary art. And as I see it, in your aesthetics, you call this the third way in the aesthetics. It's connected to transformation in two of the avant-garde traditions. One searching the art as life, and the other into abstraction and autonomy. And as I heard you, and I've read you, you speak about the third way in the aesthetics as a negotiation between because it upholds the dissensus in making things which can speak twice, as you spoke about now. But this speaking twice, comprehension and ambiguity, has also been criticized, because then all the art, in one way, can be political art. That is what they say. Can you share some reflections on the importance of transformation and the transformative power of the art connected to emancipation? How you see it now, today, in regard of the art?
No, I have a microphone. Thank you. Well, first, I've not been, advocating ambiguity. No, I said that at a certain point, while the critical dispositive become more or less aware, of the absence of any direct effect, of the dispositive. So there was this moment, where instead of purporting, to produce some kind of radical reform of perception or radical mobilization, well, critical art tended, to take a kind of more modest attitude, saying that, the dispositive speaks out of its very ambiguity, So I was not advocating this kind of double play, rather trying to dissociate two things, this kind of the first fact that, as I said, the critical dispositive is not simply something it's not simply a will. It's really a dispositive. It's a way in which art stands in our societies, and for instance, if you think of this pavilion of the Biennale, it is clear, that it is a kind of identification, of the art of the art place with a place that has a kind of vocation, a kind of natural vocation, to have political effect. So my point is precisely that there is, but there is never, that there is never a kind of, direct effect of a form of dissensus, or but in a way dissensus precisely breaks away from this problematic of the dissensus that must produce this or that effect of knowledge, empowerment, etc. So my point is that, well, what happens with forms of in a way, you cannot plan, you cannot program dissensus. You program forms of art that embody your own view of art, and if you want an artistic practice, if you think of it as being dissensual with a normal way, of organization of the space, the time, the perception, and so on. We construct, I would say, you construct its, let us say, political being, but its political being is not the same as its political effect. So, and what I try to say, notably in the Emancipated Spectator, is that, well, this is in a sense what aesthetic means. Aesthetic means that, well, there is a kind of rupture of any idea of direct effect. So, voilà, so you try to create some kind, let us say, of aesthetico-political being. It may be a film, it may be a performance, it may be an action, it may be a form of education, it may be a way of intervening in a protest or in a process of education. But the important thing, is that this the creation of this object, this situation, this narration, this performance, well, in a way, you know, has its own politics, and this politics is a kind of proposal, you know, and afterwards, it is, in fact, is up to those who are in front of them, or those who are, or those who confront them, you know, well, to be affected in this or that way by the proposition. So it means that that there is no artwork that produces directly, you know, a kind of form of political mobilization. No, artworks artworks that want, you know, to be dissensual, or that are dissensual in their mode of fabrication. Well, they are taken in a kind of wider, you know, fabric of the sensible, and it produces, you know, as I said, some slight changes, and sometimes those slight changes, you know, produce some kind of break. Well, it is well known, for instance, that, you know, in a way, you know, the May movement in Paris '68 started a bit earlier with the protest, you know, against a protest, you know, against the state politics at the Cinémathèque in Paris. So in a way, a protest about a matter, you know, a matter of management of the Cinémathèque, when the government wanted to remove, you know, the director. Well, it was part of the kind of transformation of sensibility, you know, that happened to intervene and to play a role in the May movement. But of course, there is no direct relation. There is no film. It is not because the young people had seen films made by Truffaut or Godard or Romer, you know, that they took part in this movement. But I would say that there was a kind of rupture, you know, in the normal way within which things were seen, normal forms of reaction. There is a moment when, you know, the management, you know, of an art institution becomes a political problem, you know, and people, you know, get into this situation out of their love of cinema, which love of cinema. It means a multiplicity of different things, you know. As you know, there are different films that try, and not always, you know, in a very convincing way, you know, to deal with this connection, you know. But well, this is an example. So basically, I think that really the idea we must get rid of is the idea of art being subversive in itself, you know. But it is also true that, well, the place that art spaces and art practices, you know, occupied, you know, in our common society, tends, you know, to give, you know, the curator, the directors, the artists, you know, the sense that, well, the place of art is a place of dissensus, or is a place of insurrection by itself, which is not the case. So I'm interested, well, rather in, well, the construction, you know, of small artistic adventures, you know, and how those small artistic adventures, those small attempts, you know, at creating dissenting forms, spaces, objects, images, you know, connects with these movements today, which are also criticized, of course, because there is no strategy, no party, no avant-garde, no end. But well, this is the way in which, you know, now. We don't know the future. This is the way in which now things happen, and the way in which dissensus now happens, well, in relation to the straightforward movement of capitalism. No, thank you. It's consensus.
Yes. Beautiful to hear. I follow to my next question, because I heard, and I think it can stay there. like this. Another key term in this festival has been antagonism, and it has actually been a core methodological tool or artistic strategy, we can say, creating the arts and for all the artists. Per se, you could say that the children or the youth in present time, always in history, is the antagonists. How would you, or let's begin with us. We have worked with antagonism as curators connected to agonism in the term of the political professor and thinker Chantal Mouffe. For us, this has been as making program where dissensus can coexist without being eliminated. And in your aesthetic, as I has understood it, antagonism is the name, or you call the modernist dissensus for antagonism, or antagonistic. But could you tell how you are connected, or if you are connected to the term agonism of Chantal?
Well, the question, I think, the question you are asking me is precisely the kind of question that made me doubt whether I should come or not, because I was told it's about antagonism. I tried to know, but antagonism, what does it mean? So I was a bit afraid to have to speak about antagonism, and so I decided rather to speak about dissensus, because dissensus is the same thing. This means that things are fighting, but at the same time, it's not antagonism. But to know, well, I think perhaps it would be, say, well, it would be necessary, here to really to tell again what I said at the beginning of my talk, But I'm not dealing with antagonism and agonisms are forms of relation, between individuals and collectives, Because I think that the notion of, the notions of agonism and antagonism, in Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau, it comes from a certain, certain political tradition, it is related to the question of class antagonism and class struggle, and so there is this attempt, in fact, which is more or less inherited from Gramsci, to think the coexistence, of different components, in an antagonistic movement, because at the very beginning, the idea was the idea of having several, in fact, several components, in the antagonism, But I think now it is rather moving towards some kind of idea of agonism, meaning that, democracy means that everybody coexists more or less. Of course, it's a simplification, but basically, I would say my point is not, about conflict of forces, not about conflicts of individuals or conflicts of groups. I said it's a conflict of words, and of course, I'm desiring also to think the democratic space as the space of differences and the space of some forms of contradictions and tensions and so on. Now, I think what remains for me, is the fact that dissensus is not a conflict of groups, but a conflict of words. This means, for instance, if you think of this barricade, of course, I started from the barricade. It's a kind of provocation, because it seems to say that politics only exist when there are insurrections, and some people think that I really think that there are only politics when there is insurrection, which is not the case at all. But I think that there are when you are making a protest, where you are trying to create some kind of artistic form of dissensus, well, in a way, you are dividing the world in two, you know, which doesn't mean that there are the good and the bad, you know, but there is the way things are normally, you know, and the way you want things to be. So in the case, either in the case of the insurrection or in the case of the Occupy movement, you know, well, there is a way things are, you know, the way the streets are used. There is a dynamic of commerce. There is an authoritarian government, you know, who wants to take over, you know, a park which is just for, you know, for leisure and discussion, you know, etc. And walking and loitering and makes it a shopping mall, making a shopping mall. So from this point of view, Dissensus divides the people, you know, between the people adhering, you know, to the project of the government and people refusing it. And it's well known that in the movement of Gezi Park in Istanbul, in fact, there were several, you know, militant groups, you know, with their own perspectives, you know, and their own politics, and so it was not at all a kind of unanimous people, you know. But in that sense, you could say that Gezi Park or Occupy Wall Street or May 15 in Madrid or Nuit Debout in Paris, you know. Well, there are a lot of different groups, different perspectives, different understandings of politics that coexist. But they coexist on the basis of a partition. Normally, well, for instance, in France, there is a labor law which is destined, you know, to make France, you know, in the end, really becoming part of the true capitalist modern world, you know. And there is those who reject this law, and there is this rejection. And after there can be negotiations, the union can negotiate, and also on the Place de la République in Paris, it's a kind of mess, you know, with all kinds of people saying entirely contradictory things, you know. Well, but you know, I think so. It can be called an agonism, but agonism, you know, agonism exists, I would say, you know, in the context of dissensus itself, which is not an opposition of groups, but really an opposition of two ways of constructing a common world.
Working with the art the last 20 years, not just as curators, but as making compositions or by combining artists' performative, it has been very interesting for me this time, for this festival, to put the curators in long-term durational processes where they are not just curators, but also artists simultaneously for a long time. So I have urged them or demanded them to work with time-space access in a very particular way for a very long run. And for this particular festival, I did this inspired in search of social, or not, in utopias. So in a way, I have urged them to work in practical terms, to work with time's space access. For me, it is a way of using the past for making a future in the presence, embodiment. This is the performative power of being in transformations. And a concrete example is for the opera Trond Reinholdsen, the opera composer in the festival, and I have made, which take and examine the communistic social utopias, critical in a horror opera, outside for 3 days, durational, making tensions between individual and collective. So people can walk in and out of this during the 3 days and nights. But time-space relations is also very important in all your reflections. actually like the core of the critical potential in the arts. You don't think it can be used as a method, but as I have understood you, or can you share your reflections of how time-space relations is connected to utopias, or the necessity of utopias, of building the importance of collectives for the future? The importance of social utopias.
Well, so it's okay. Well, I had always had a problem, you know, with the notion of utopia, you know. So, because the notion of utopia, you know, in fact, you know, includes two different ideas, you know. The ideas of, well, an estrangement, an idea precisely of occupying the place, which is not part of the normal, you know, allotment or distribution of places, you know, on the one end, but on the other end, you know, in utopia is at the same time the non-place and the good place. There was a discussion about the very etymology of the word, but that's not just a philological question, you know. The question is whether utopia is thought of as some kind of project, and it has all very often thought of as a kind of project for the future. So in a way, a kind of program, a program for constructing the futures, you know. And well, my point is a bit, perhaps is a bit different, or perhaps we can use the concept of utopia differently. Well, my first idea is that, presents are not constructed from futures or from the intuitions of futures. That presents are all, but it is the other way around, you know. But really, it is a present that creates a future. And so this means that, we create. Of course, you create some kind of specific space-time dispositives, but very often, in fact, you are not to create them. You are not to create them because they happen. They happen. So, you know, the Occupy movement, or we can say that nobody thought that would be good. That would be good to have people sharing the same life during 1 month in Madrid or in Istanbul. That would be a good utopia, etc. No, it happened. It happened that way, meaning that the ordinary form of political process was turned into something else, you know. And I think we must always have this in mind. But art is when art wants, you know, very often, you know, to be political or to create utopias, you know. Well, it is in a certain form, a complicated form, let us say, of mimesis, you know, in relation to politics or to political utopias or political moments of utopia, you know. And so I think for me, what art has to preserve is, I would say, a dimension of experimentation. Experimentation, I don't mean experimental art, you know. I mean art as producing experimental situations. So it means possibly creating experimental space-time dispositif as the one that you describe. But of course, for me, it's quite abstract. I should be on the place, you know. But what it reminds me of also of certain forms of art. I remember, for instance, you know, this Spanish, you know, playwright, you know, who tries, I would say, some forms of reenactment, for instance, where he did a lot of performances, you know, with facts coming from in fact, workers strikes, and the creation then the dissolution of a workers association, forms of workers workers' autonomy, and so he replaces them, you know, in sort of open spaces, you know, where people are shown, you know, so on a screen, you know, the last assembly, you know, in which the workers decided to put an end, you know, to their experiment, you know, and the spectators, you know, are asked, you know, to play the role, you know, of these workers, in fact, and well, to take their part, you know, and and of course you have it is one case you can say it's an experiment, you know. When I was there, it was a real disaster, you know. It was some kind of because he had always to, you know, to force people didn't want to participate, and you know, it's very often the problem with participatory art, but people don't want to participate, and in a way you must allow people not to participate, you know, because there may be some kind of tyranny, you know, also in forms of activism, where people must become active and they don't want to become active, you know. So of course I don't know, you know, how it happens, you know, with this opera. So I cannot comment on it. I comment only on the forms, you know, of participative art or experimental situations, you know, that I know. And well, so I would not call it again utopia. I would call it experiments, you know. And an experiment is always precisely, you know, made with the idea that the experiment may not produce anything, you know, may not produce anything. This means different things. This means it may be a failure, nothing happens, you know, or something happens, but it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen exactly, you know, in the time of the performance, you know. Well, the point with art, but it's also the point with education in general, you know, is that it is very rare that effects, you know, are produced, you know, in the very time of the action, you know. Effects are produced, well, you know, in a kind of unpredictable, in fact, period of time, you know, and through metamorphoses, and so for me, it's very important, you know, in the creation of experimental situation, you know, to leave the possibility precisely of this distension of temporalities.